I think it's always great that I get a little music to move furniture to before I get up here. Good morning, my name is Michael Hoddy. We are so glad you're here if it's your first time, if you're a guest with us. Here at Long Hill, we are so glad that you've joined us today on Memorial Day weekend. And this is a day that is known for a lot of things. It's known for furniture sales. It's known as the unofficial start to summer, although you would never know it by going outside. Our community pool opened this week, and I don't think anyone's going to that thing, because it was like 50 degrees yesterday. But it's known for barbecues. But I think behind it, and most of us are aware of this, it's known for something that is so much more than that. Because tomorrow, we don't just grill hamburgers and hot dogs. We remember the men and the women in the armed services who have given their lives for the freedom that we enjoy. And some of you in this room or are watching online, you've put yourself on the line for this nation. And we are so thankful. We owe a debt of gratitude to you. But some people have not only done that, they've actually paid the ultimate price. And have done that throughout the history of this country. And we remember them. And I think a great question to ask is why? Why do we remember? Why do we go back and remember? We remember because of the sacrifice that's involved. We remember because they paid a price for our freedom. And we remember because we ought not to forget the liberty that we enjoy because it was not cheap and we should not take it for granted. And it's also to remind us of something. It's to remind us that this kind of service and sacrifice is what it means to be an American. And I think, I'm just going to say it, I think in our divided times, our politically divided times, our culturally divided times, just all the different cracks that we can see in our society, if we all remembered this more deeply, it would give us a perspective that would change us. It would change how we see ourselves. It would change how we see our neighbors. It would change how we see our communities. It would change how we see the people who are different than we are, because that's one of the threads that unites us together. There's something that is implied in the fact that we need to remember, that we have a day or we have something like that we need to remember. And it's simply this, that we forget. I am one of the most forgetful people you will ever meet. The fact that I make it out of the house every morning with my keys, my wallet, all the articles of clothing I should be wearing. I've already forgotten 3 or 4 things this morning. It is my poor wife, Grace. One of my sons is kind of the same way, and so we are just absolute chaos, contained in a family. But we need to remember because of the fact that we forget. And so this is not just about this weekend. This is not just about Memorial Day where we remember and we are thankful. This is about our lives, and this is also about God. This is about God. We are people who forget who God is and what God has done, and so we often need to remember. And here's why. Remembering gives us better perspective on how the past ought to shape the present and the future. Remembering, it gives us a better perspective on how the past ought to shape the present and the future. I go through so many times in my life where there's something that happens or there's a circumstance that comes up, and at this point in my life I can look back, and some of you can do this too, where you say, I've seen this before. I've seen something like this before. Maybe it's not the same thing, but I've seen a version of it, or maybe you know somebody who's been through it before, and what it does is it gives you the perspective to not just be completely freaked out by whatever's happening, but to say, I can walk through this. I can walk through this with faith. Yes, it's going to be tough. Yes, it may be difficult, but I have seen something before. I'm aware of something. I have been reminded of something that allows me not only to walk into the present, but also into the future. What's been accomplished in the past, maybe what we needed to learn from the past, what we have to be thankful for from the past, and what the cost was. One of the things I love about being part of Long Hill Chapel, which is a very multi-generational church, is there are people who have seen more of life than we have. There are people who have been here longer than I have. There's people who have perspectives, whether it's from experience, whether it's from the fact that they've gone through a little bit more of life than some of the rest of us. And that's one of the greatest gifts that we can give and receive. And sometimes when we remember, it's not just for good things. It's so we can remember what we need to avoid. Remember what we need to do differently. Remember how it is that we continually each need to grow. And I don't think we forget because we don't care. I just think there's a lot of other things that happen in life that overwhelm us. It's time, it's circumstances, it's our busy schedules, it's just the constant bombardment of information that is life in the 21st century. And so in the midst of that, we need to remind ourselves and each other of what's true. I have a cell phone, and many of you have a cell phone, and there's one item on my cell phone that consumes the vast amount of memory on the phone. I don't know if you're like this. You got like the phone that had 8 gigabytes, then 16, then 32, then 64, then 128, then it just keeps growing. And I'm like, what did I ever do back there when I had like all this little amount of memory in my phone, and now I have this huge amount of memory? You know what mine is filled with? Pictures and videos. Pictures and videos. Today's count for Michael Hoddy's iPhone is 44,040 pictures and videos. From yesterday all the way back to the year of our Lord 2000. And no, I didn't take them with an iPhone. I'm not from the future or something like that. They've just been imported. But I have 44,000 of them. I don't know what's in there at this point. But there's all of these. I collect them. I have a hard time deleting them. Even if I take 20 pictures of my son, I have a hard time. So they're all there. My phone is chaos. There's hundreds of gigabytes of photos and videos. And you know why that is? You know, yesterday, Christopher had a baseball tournament, and that's my older son, and I machine gunned hundreds of pictures yesterday, of which probably like 10 are good pictures, but I just did that. And parents, you kind of get this. I do this because I want to remember. I want to look back on this time. I know there will be a point in the future where those times are in the past. And I want to remember because I'm proud of him, because I love this season of life. I am so proud of him because he's accomplished something difficult. And so remembering gives us this perspective. I take all those pictures because of our relationship. You know, and I have more of my wife Grace and our boys and all the adventures of the times we've had together, my kids as they've gone from babies to growing up and going through this before. I don't know if you've ever been to a concert recently. You've been to a concert recently? What happens at concerts now? You look out and there's a sea of what? Cell phones. Cell phones everywhere. And I'm just like, put your phone down and enjoy the concert. Why do people do that? Is it because the video quality is going to be so amazing? Is it because the song that's recorded through this little tiny microphone is... No, you can go listen to that on Spotify. It's because you're trying to remember the moment. You're trying to capture a moment that you can go back to. So this weekend, as we continue in our remembrance of Memorial Day, we also continue in our series in the Old Testament book of Joshua, and we encounter a story where something happened, something changed. There's a remembrance story. And we're actually going to read a good bit today from Joshua 3 into Joshua 4. And what's been happening is Joshua is now leading the people. Moses, who is the great leader that all the movies are made about, has passed on. And now they're about to cross a second river. They're coming out of the wilderness into the promised land. And it's about time to go. There's been a lot of kind of work up to this moment, but it's now time to start to move out and to move on. And so we pick up in Joshua 3:1. And it says this: early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests, and by the way, the ark of the covenant represents the presence of God with the people, which was a very unique thing. You are to move out from your positions and then follow it. Then here's like a confidence-inspiring sentence. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits. That's like a half mile. It's a good distance between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Have you ever come to a point in your life where you realize that you're the adults in the room? Like there's no other actual adults that are past you. You're it. It's a terrifying, it's a sobering moment. Sometimes we become aware of this, when our grandparents or our parents pass on. You know, there's been a few times in this church where one of the great pillars of the church has passed on, and as much as we celebrate their lives, we become aware of the fact that we're the adults in the room. There's no one else. It's this point where you feel incredibly exposed and incredibly vulnerable. And certainly those of us who are in our 30s and 40s right now, and there's a lot of you in the room who kind of fit that category, we are faced with the reality of having to become the adults in the room. You're looking at the fact that there's no they past you. You are the they. You are the ones who have to make the decisions, who have to carry things forward, who have to do the best job that you can of that. And it's a sobering, terrifying even experience. That's who Joshua is at this moment. There's no Moses anymore. And he's been talking about all the things that God's going to do and the ways it's going to go and that they're going to cross the river and that God's going to do all these amazing things. But now it's time to actually begin to do it. And one of the things I've been learning in my life as an adult, as a husband, as a father, as a leader, as a pastor, is that it is one thing to talk about doing something. It is actually another thing to actually do something about your talk. It's great to talk about all that's going to happen. It's great to talk about the future. It's great to talk about all these things. But then at some point, you actually have to become accountable for what you're saying. And one of the challenges we have in our world in general is there's a lot of people saying a lot of things, and there's far less people putting their lives, putting everything on the line to actually do any portion of those things. And this is especially hard when, as the text says here, when you're going somewhere you've never been before, when you're stepping into the unknown, it's very hard to actually do something about your talk. You know, they say, there's this phrase, we all know it, talk is cheap. It feels so significant and powerful. I'm going to tell this story. Like, the staff always busts on me when I tell about the fact that I got married, like right here, like 25 years ago. But I remember something about that day. You know, I got down on one knee and, asked my wife, who's now my wife, Grace, to marry me, and shockingly, she said yes. But there was this moment before our wedding when she was to come through that door and I was to come out that door. And I was back there in the hallway, and I know exactly the spot I was, and I was looking out the window, and I was just aware of the fact that suddenly all the things I said, suddenly the love that I professed was going to start to cost something. Because I was about to do something that would change my life forever. And many of you have done a version of that. But it was one thing to talk about it. It was now another thing to do it. And 25 years later, and some of you have been married much longer than I have, continuing to do that, continuing to hold up those vows you made with your lips, but to actually do it with your life is a whole different thing. And so Joshua, as he talks about what's going to happen, he's not talking about it from this standpoint of confidence because he's actually done it. He's talking about it not because he's led that way before. He hasn't even really done this yet, but he's doing it because of something about God, about something he's seen in the past about who God is, about seeing the miracles, about seeing God present in the hard times before he was leading. But then there's this thing that God does, and it's kind of this typical God fashion thing he does, and we've already seen it in the story. God gives them part of the instructions, but not all of the instructions. He says, do this thing, but I'm not going to show you how it all goes. You know, when the priests and the Levites pick up the ark and they start carrying it, follow them. But guess where the priests and the Levites took the ark? Into the middle of a river. So they take this thing out, and yeah, the waters move to the side, but they're going into this river. Rivers are not supposed to part. They're supposed to overwhelm you. And so God, that's quite the ringtone you have there. And so God leads them in this direction, and now they have to do something about it. We go on. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Joshua said to the priests, take up the ark of the covenant and pass on ahead of the people. And so they took it up and went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Again, words means something, but action means so much more. Joshua's leadership to this point has been largely hypothetical. He has the title, but he doesn't have the track record yet. And so what happens is now is the moment it becomes real. And I think there's something important for us to understand, all of us who desire to be leaders of any kind, whether it's in your business, whether it's in your community, whether it's in this church or another church, whether it's in your home with your families and your kids. Look at what happens there. Today, I will begin to exalt you. So God does the exalting. God is the one who raises you up. God is the one who gives you honor when you follow him. You don't do that for yourself. If you find a leader who needs to do that for themselves, you found a leader who is leading for the wrong reasons. Good leaders, whether they're husbands or mothers and fathers or wives or pastors or political leaders, they do the job faithfully and humbly, and they let someone else do the exalting. That's when you found a leader that's worth following. The story goes on. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of Jordan's waters, so stick with me here, there's a lot we're going to read in this moment. Go and stand in the river. Joshua said to the Israelites, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites, lots of ites. These are the people who are living in the promised land. It wasn't just like this vacation resort with no opposition. There was some fighting that was going to happen. See the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. So when the people broke camp across the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. And now the Jordan is at flood stage all during the harvest. So this isn't just like walking in a normal river. This is like walking in a flooded river. We've had a lot of rain here in New Jersey. Some of you have seen the rivers. There's a lot more water. It's moving a lot faster. That's what I imagine was happening here with the Jordan. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that's the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. We're going to get to Jericho in the next couple weeks. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. And so the priests here become maybe the first crossing guards in history. And so God is leading the people into the middle of the river. This is the Jordan River. It says, when we look at it and survey, it's about 100 feet wide. It's up to 10 feet or so deep. And so you think about it this way, it's not insurmountable. You could probably figure out a way to get across it, but it's not easily crossed. And the waters don't part and wait for them. The waters only part when they take a step. The waters aren't just there waiting for them. It's like, yay, God did a thing. I get to go across on dry ground. It's only when they step into the water. And friends, this is something we need to learn about how God works. That he's waiting for us to take a step. He's not asking us to step all the way, but he's asking us to put our foot in the water. And so maybe for some of us today, there's a place where we're waiting, we're praying, we're saying, God, show yourself and how you're going to work, how you're going to do this thing. I'm waiting for you to do it. And what he's been saying to you, or maybe what he's saying to you, is take a step. Take a step. It doesn't have to be a big step. It doesn't have to be 100 feet across the river, because I'm the one who's going to do that. God's the one who's going to do that. But it always starts with a step. And what happens in that moment, once they take that step, it's not just like, a little less water or like a mud pit. We're all familiar with mud pits right now. My yard. is sort of a mud pit right now. Much less so than it used to be, by the way. But it's dry ground. And so what God does is not just enough to get them through it. He does so much more than that, and I think it is so they would remember who God was and what God did. So now, they've crossed the river, they're in the promised land. Finally, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, but now there's enemies around. There's a lot of stuff to do. It's a new place, just like any new place you move into. A lot to do, but look what God tells them to do. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you, and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." And so the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood. And there they are to this day. And this day, by the way, is when this account was written. You guys got through all of 3 and a bunch of chapter 4 with me, and you're all still here. But what we see that God does is, instead of moving into this spot where there's a lot of stuff to do, and there's probably some enemies to fight, and we have to figure out where we're going to camp, and it's a new place, and we don't know where anything is, and we have to do all the things that you do when you move into a new house or a new location. You have to figure out where the grocery store is. You have to figure out, like, who's going to turn on the cable TV. You have to do all of those things. God instead says something. He says, "Stop and remember." Stop and remember. Go out into the place where I just did this great work. Get some stones, and these aren't like little stones. These are pretty good-sized stones. I have some big stones in my yard. I imagine that they're sort of like that. You actually have moved those stones. You know, they're just these big rocks, and they're carried over. And I don't know if you've ever tried to stack rocks on top of each other. It's not easy. And so this is something that takes a lot of work. It takes effort. It takes time. But it's also something significant, because it's a monument that's not easily broken down. It's a monument that stays there. But the monument isn't for God. God did the work. But the monument, it says there, when your children ask you what happened here, now you can tell them what happened here. It's for them to remember. Remembrance is an intentional act. Remembrance is an intentional act. You know, we're here on Memorial Day weekend, and there's a lot of things you can do, and they're all good things, and you ought to do them. If you have your family, you ought to share a meal with them. You ought to do all of the great things. If there's some things that you can get for 30% off, it's a great time to do it. But you will miss the point of why we are on this weekend. And when it comes to what God has done, you will miss the point of that unless you are intentional about remembering. And sometimes we need to do something that reminds us over and over again. And when we do that kind of remembrance, it takes a lot of effort. It's not something that just happens to us, but it's something that's not easily undone. And when it comes to our journey, our relationship with God, remembrance is the thing that becomes the launch pad for future faith. Listen to this. If we don't create reminders of God's faithfulness in the past, we will forget God's faithfulness when the odds seem long. if we don't create reminders of God's goodness, we will forget God's goodness when things seem dark and not so good. If we don't create reminders of God's power, how he's intervened, how he's done something we could never do, we'll forget God's power when the obstacles seem overwhelming. If you don't remember what God did, you're going to doubt what he's doing now, and you'll have a difficult time grasping his vision for what's in the future. Remember, God leads them out, but he doesn't show them like this, this map of everything that's going to happen. He shows them the next step. And this isn't because of a deficiency, by the way, in God. This is because there's something about us. There's something that marks our humanity, our condition. And this is why it says, when people ask you, when your children ask you, then you can remind them. Friends in Long Hill Chapel who have been at life, who have been at faith, who have been here longer than we have. Sometimes we look around and say, what's going on? What's going on in our world? What's going on in our lives? You have the gift of being able to remind us. But then there's something interesting that happens. For all that this monument took to build, for all the intention of getting the stones out of the middle of the river and carrying them all that distance and trying to build them into something, the people don't stay here. They don't stay. They don't camp out around the monument and say, cool, we're in the promised land. We did it. God did it. They build the monument, but then a few verses later in this chapter, they began to move on. They move on from the monument. Even with this place and all this effort, the monument is not a destination, it's a waypoint. The passage says that the stones were stacked up where the priest and the ark, the presence of God, remember that represents the presence of God, was, but the ark's not there anymore. It's moved on. And one of the best reasons, by the way, to read these Old Testament accounts, because I think a lot of us sit here and say, our world's very different, things are very different, my life is very different. There's no Perizzites and Jebusites and Canaanites and Hittites and Hivites and all the other ites. I live in Chatham, Madison, don't have any of those people around. But there's something that's true about the human condition, that even though the language, the time, the land, the circumstances are different, people are very much the same. We just do the same things over and over again. And one of the reasons to read these Old Testament accounts is to remind us about us, to remind us of who we are. In this time in our world, it's something we naturally do, but especially now, we forget our history. We forget what has happened in the past, and we think everything we're experiencing is for the first time and nobody's ever seen this before. Or we think we have progressed and are so much more advanced than all those Neanderthals back there were. Look at how smart we are. And then something happens in our world, or it happens in our lives, or it happens in our politics, or it happens, any number of circumstances, and suddenly we're reminded that human nature is human nature. It often doesn't change. People have the same tendencies over and over again. Much later in the Bible, by the way, the Apostle Paul writes about the Old Testament in 1 Corinthians 10, and he says this: you ought to pay attention to this so that you know how to walk. You should learn from the history that goes before you, because then you'll know what not to do and how not to do it. There's warnings from there. And I think even when God works, and this is very hard, by the way, there's a place where God has worked. He's been faithful. He's shown his power. He's shown his goodness. He's shown his faithfulness. It is so easy for us to say, here's where God is. Let's build something around where God is. Let's stay here. Let's stay where it made sense. Let's stay where it was comfortable. Let's stay where we could bask in the warmth of all that God had done. But God is moving on, and we should remember the monument. We should go back to it and remind ourselves and remind the generations coming after us. But God has moved on. There are churches and there are movements who die trying to stay where they are. There are people who miss out on all God has for them because moving out from the monument takes incredible faith and incredible perseverance. It takes a complete dependence on God's power and his direction. And so the monument here in this passage, it's still there, but they move on. And they do that because you're supposed to remember, but you're not supposed to remain. You're supposed to remember, but you're remembering not to stay there. You're remembering there to go forward. Just like this weekend as we gather around our barbecues and whatever it is we're doing, we go to the parades, we see the flags. We're there to remember, but we're not there to stay there. We're there to allow that to shape how we go forward, to go forward with the same commitment and sacrifice as the people who have gone before us. And when it comes to our spiritual lives, we're to do the exact same thing. We're to be those kind of people. Because the presence of God, just like that ark that went out into the river, it's among us where we are, but it's also leading us beyond where we are. And just like God was back there, where the stones are stacked by the river, he's right here with us. And whatever you're facing today, he'll be up there. He'll be up ahead. He'll be every step with you, going before us. Then, you and I, us as a church, us as a people, us as the ones who follow hard after Jesus, we will know, as the passage says, which way to go, even if we've never been there before. Would you pray with me? God, we come and we remember, and I think in our nation we remember the significance of those who have sacrificed, who have paid a price that we can't even begin to comprehend, many of us. And so we're inspired and challenged by their legacy. We remember that sacrifice, but we allow it to motivate us to live differently, even as citizens here. But God, I pray for our walk with you, our walk through life as people who follow Jesus, that same remembrance of what God has done, what has been accomplished on our behalf through the cross of Christ, through the ways that God has been faithful in the past in small ways and big ways, to everything that has brought us to this moment, we'd remember. But that remembrance wouldn't just anchor us back there. It would give us the perspective, the confidence, the encouragement, and the power to continue to walk forward, even if it's a way we've never walked before. We thank you for this moment to stop and remember. But we pray as we go out these doors, knowing who you are and knowing what you've done, it would give us the hope to live into the future differently, holding on to you, but continuing to walk forward on the path. I pray for all the ways that this affects our lives individually. It affects our lives in this world as a community of faith. I pray that your Spirit would speak to us now in Jesus' name.